First process modeling method that we're going to cover is the swim lane flowchart. And just for brevity's sake, I'm going to call these flowcharts for the rest of the lecture. Flowcharts are by far the most common way of illustrating processes. And there's good reason for that. They're simple to understand and relatively easy to create and maintain. But they might have a couple of shortcomings, so stay tuned for that discussion later. Given that a basic course in business analysis is a prerequisite for this course, you've probably worked with flowcharts in the past. For that reason, we're going to keep this lecture pretty light. So let's get started and talk about the notation first. There are 5 main components of a flowchart, and we're going to go through each one. First, usually there is a big rectangle that contains all the other elements. It's representative of the business process that you're modeling. Its basic job is to contain all the other elements, and so we call it the container. Not very creative, but that's fine. Next, we very importantly have swim lanes in swim lane flowcharts. Swim lanes are subcontainers that are representative of actors. Whenever we place another shape in a particular swim lane, it means that that shape is executed by the role that the swim lane represents. We also have activities, which are the bread and butter of any flowchart, and they're represented by rectangles. Activities represent discrete, straightforward actions that are performed by an actor. Whenever someone does something, that's an activity. We also have flows, which are represented by arrows. They show the sequence that the process follows. And finally, we have decisions, which are represented by diamonds. Decisions illustrate that the process can branch. It's common to write some kind of question in the center of the diamond shape that reflects the underlying logical decision point, and then to label the flows that exit the decision with the answers to that question. So is that it? Yeah, pretty much. That's it. I mean, the simplicity of flowcharts is really one of the reasons for their popularity. But you can, and you'll frequently see this, you can add additional components if you so desire. I've seen people add documents, data stores, annotations, a whole host of other elements to flowcharts, and that's fine. When I'm teaching flowcharts to people, I strongly encourage them to add start and end events to their flowcharts so their readers understand where the process starts and finishes. But again, this is a very simple methodology with few intrinsic elements. But this highlights a small problem with flowcharts. There is no standardization. People can do pretty much whatever they want with them as long as they're commonly understood by stakeholders. So now let's look at an example. I'm putting a very simple and actually kind of ridiculous example of a flowchart up on the screen. Okay, this is, believe it or not, this is a fully acceptable swim lane flowchart. I'm going to save some time and not step through the process, but I will call out some of the features that we just discussed. First, we have some text all the way over to the left that has the name of the process. It's called the greeting process, and that's the container, by the way. Going over to the right just a bit, you can see the role 1 and role 2 swim lanes. They indicate who does what. And then within the diagram, there are a bunch of rectangles. Each one of those reflects an activity performed. We also have the flows, the arrows that go from one shape to a next, and they show the order of execution. And then in the middle, you can see a yellow diamond, which enables the role 1 actor to perform different activities based on the particular situation. And that's that. Of course, flowcharts in real life typically are much more serious and dense and complicated. But if you can make this flowchart that we just covered, you can pretty much make any flowchart because the normal components are all depicted in that simple diagram. But now let's take a look at flowchart notation, compare it to our requirements earlier, and see how the notation stacks up. We mentioned that modeling notations need to have a bunch of things, which I'm putting on the screen now. Let's take a look at each one of these. Okay, first, activities, subprocesses, and flows. Well, we know that flowcharts have activities and flows, so those requirements are met. Subprocesses are not one of the basic components of flowcharts, but there is a shape which people often add to flowcharts to extend it to support subprocesses. It's not standard, but it gets the job done. So we can consider this big requirement to be met as well. Events. There unfortunately are no event shapes in flowcharts. What people often do, including myself, and I mentioned it before, is to borrow the start and end events from UML. We'll actually get to that in the next lecture. But we can't really say that the notation meets this requirement. Next, decisions. So yes, there are decisions in flowcharts, as we've seen, but we talked about two different types of decision or gateway earlier, and we might wonder how we can model parallel activities that happen at the same time. This is typically performed by not having decision shapes at all, and just having two or more flow arrows leave an activity to go to the activities that are happening in parallel. Sometimes this raises questions, but it's pretty acceptable. We can consider this requirement to be met. Roles is next. Roles are indicated, of course, by the swim lanes, so we meet that requirement. Next is information. Well, there isn't really any mechanism for modeling information in flowcharts, and it's actually quite rare for information to be modeled at all in them. So this requirement, we can't say that it's met, no. And finally, other artifacts. With other artifacts, it's the same as with information. There's no normal way of modeling it, so this doesn't meet the requirement. So I would say that overall, as a notation, the swim lane flowchart is kind of disappointing. We had 6 requirements for process modeling, and the most common method used today only meets 3 of them. Does that mean that flowcharts are a bad method? No, not at all. It's a great method for when you have simple processes to model or when you want to communicate a model to non-technical stakeholders. It has limited analysis value, but nonetheless, it can be a useful tool for a quick and dirty work. So why don't we move on to the next notation, and this one comes from UML.